Hello all, and welcome to the Economic Innovation Group's Rise of Remote event in partnership with Upwork. We're going to give folks just a minute or so to trickle in, and then we'll get started. All right. Well, hello again, and welcome to the second of 3 events in the Economic Innovation Group's Rise of Remote series in partnership with Upwork. I'm Melitza Kosick, the Chief of Staff at EIG, and want to thank you so much for being here with us today as we explore trends in remote work post-pandemic. As you all know, the COVID-19 public health crisis pushed approximately half of the American workforce out of their physical offices and into the remote at an unprecedented speed. And while the shift to remote work has been underway, the rapid acceleration of telework over the pandemic represents the most drastic shift our workforce has seen this century. So as vaccines are rolled out across the country and employers explore return to work models, remote, hybrid, we are going to explore in our second session in this series the critical role of public policy in smoothing that transition to remote work for businesses, workers, and the US economy by promoting reliable broadband access and providing incentives to draw in workers. So first we'll hear from US Senator Susan Collins of Maine in a pre-recorded conversation with DJ Nordquist, EIG's Executive Vice President. And then we're going to transition to the live panel portion of the webinar with guest speakers Ben Stewart of Tulsa Remote, Kathryn de Wit of the Pew Charitable Trusts, Laurel Farrer of Distribute Consulting, and Michael McGeary of Upwork. And we will have Kim Hart of Axios moderating the session. So we hope to have a couple of minutes towards the end of the webinar for our live panel to answer audience questions. So please drop your questions into the Q&A function as you have them throughout the session. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and we'll post the recording on our website afterward. And so without further ado, I am going to get started by playing the video from Senator Collins and DJ Nordquist.
Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm DJ Nordquist, Executive Vice President at the Economic Innovation Group. And thanks for joining us today for our second session in our Rise of Remote virtual event series in partnership with Upwork. Today, we'll be focused on the public policy implications for the rise of remote work, a phenomenon that happened very quickly as a result of the pandemic and something I think we've all had to live through for better or worse for the last year and a half. I'd especially like to thank Senator Susan Collins for taking the time to join us today for this important conversation. Senator Collins is the senior senator from Maine and the most senior Republican woman, and was first elected to the Senate 25 years ago. The motto of Maine, which I looked up, is Dirigo. I hope I pronounced that correctly with my many years of Latin, which means I lead. And that is certainly appropriate for you, Senator, and Maine is very, very lucky to have you. As many of you have seen, the Senator has been instrumental in the recent bipartisan infrastructure negotiations. She's been a national champion for closing the digital divide and expanding access to broadband internet in her own state and across the nation. She hails from rural Maine, right next to the Canadian border, where her hometown of Caribou, I looked it up, has a population of just over 8,200. So she knows rural America very well. Senator Collins, as you know, bipartisanship is a rarity these days. Nevertheless, you've worked on a range of bipartisan issues, including broadband infrastructure initiatives. And as I mentioned, you played a key role in infrastructure negotiations, a key pillar of which is broadband infrastructure expansion. I'd note that the US doesn't even rank in the top 10 countries with the fastest broadband, sadly. And guess who beats us? Romania and Thailand. Earlier this year, you worked with Senator Jackie Rosen, Democrat of Nevada, to introduce the American Broadband Build-Out Act, Act to increase access to broadband services in rural America. And you've also worked with Senator Doug Jones and Joe Manchin in the past on digital connectivity. And it looks like there's about $65 billion in the infrastructure package for broadband expansion. So congratulations to you on that. Can you tell us why access to high-speed broadband internet for the residents of Maine and the American people is something you are so passionate about, and how this all came together?
Well, first, DJ, let me thank you so much for inviting me to join you in this important discussion. I find it ironic that what I am doing this morning is working from home in my home in Bangor, Maine, rather than going into my Bangor office, which is what I would have done prior to COVID. And I find that I'm able to do far more Zooms and webinars and other broadband-based applications and reach, ironically, more people by working right here in my living room. So that's the plus side. The downside is periodically I get a notice across my screen that says internet connection unstable. And that's because I live in an old house. And while Bangor is the third largest city in Maine, at 35,000 people, it's not a big metropolitan area, and we still have some gaps. The problem is way worse in rural parts of our country, including parts of rural Maine. But what has changed is there is now bicameral, bipartisan agreement that we simply cannot have unserved areas in our country. And I believe that that is one of the most important lessons from the pandemic. Now, I will mention that in case my staff gets very excited at hearing what I've just said, that I do not think that every job can be done from home. And I do think you lose something, some synergy, when people are not in the office together and able to easily exchange ideas, pick up information, talk with one another. But I will say that in other cases, the service can actually be better. And a great example of that is telemedicine, where physicians and other healthcare professionals are able to check up on a patient without that patient having to travel, in some cases, a long distance to see a specialist. So I believe that there is virtually universal support for expanding broadband to unserved areas.
I think telemedicine is obviously a great example. And, obviously during the pandemic, we saw just exactly how big, and some of us lived through the digital divide that is often talked about. An estimated 35% of rural households lack reliable access to broadband at minimally acceptable speeds, as you mentioned. And in Maine, nearly 1 in 5 households don't have broadband internet subscription, according to census. And, I think telemedicine is a great example. I think, some of us are lucky that we are able to do our jobs remotely. There are obviously a lot of jobs that are not conducive to that. But can you expand a little bit on what the current moment makes bringing broadband access to all communities so critical?
The COVID epidemic really taught us how important broadband is, and also that it creates economic and social disparities and inequities if we don't have it. And let me give you some examples from my experience here in Maine. I have talked to town managers in rural Maine who have told me that some of their students, when the schools were going in a hybrid mode, had to go to the local library in order to get to a hotspot where they could complete their assignments and send them in. And the idea of students having to congregate outside of a library on the steps in order to do their homework and in order to participate just revealed the inequities that we have. I mentioned telemedicine, which is something that I've actually been pushing for many years, and to have adequate reimbursement for it. Well, under the CARES Act, which was passed early last year, we finally had Medicare reimbursement for telemedicine, and a lot of insurance companies also started reimbursing for telemedicine. And that allowed a senior last winter living in a rural community in Maine with a cancer that could only be treated in one of our larger communities to be able to get a checkup from home to decide whether or not she needed to come into the doctor. It's also been used in Maine to deliver hospice care to people who are at the end of their lives. Not as good as having the person in the room, but a godsend during the COVID pandemic, and particularly for our island communities. And yet there were some home health nurses who told me that if only the video had been a little better, if only the connection had been more reliable, they would have been able to do so much more. And of course, remote work. Now, there's some jobs, if you're working in a factory, working from home almost certainly is not going to work out for you. But a lot of office jobs we found can be done from home. And I think this is going to have implications for the development of rural America.
Well, that dovetails very nicely into my next question. But before I mention that, I did want to say I read an article, you were talking about schools. I was fascinated to see that there were some schools that actually deployed school buses that were like mobile hotspots. So they say, necessity is the mother of invention, but that's obviously not ideal. So hopefully your legislation will come to fruition and we don't need that anymore. But I wanted to talk a little bit about your last point about, rural America and loss of population. So, many parts of the country, including your own state of Maine, have experienced population decline and decreasing rates of new business formation, and are generally struggling to participate in the 21st century economy. In your state, for example, you've lost, prime age working adults over the last decade, and the birth rate, that's a national problem, is now the lowest it's been since 1973. So that's going to have obviously long-term impacts on the labor force in the future, throughout the country. We've seen reports that the pandemic prompted many people to leave dense urban areas and seek out your home state of Maine as their new home. I think I know at least 10 people who did that. And it's that's helping working age Americans, work remotely and hopefully will revitalize rural America. We found an interesting stat from the Maine Association of Realtors that 25% of home sales in Maine were out of state in 2019. And then that number grew to 32% in 2020. So, maybe the little tagline on Maine's license plate that says, vacation land, maybe that'll need to be updated, so that you have more permanent, urban transplants up in Maine. How can states like Maine take advantage of the shift underway in the American workforce and use broadband expansion to attract more workers, countering the negative economic impacts of population decline?
This is one of the most interesting developments as a result of the pandemic. We have seen in rural Maine, people move here who previously might have had a summer home or had vacationed here in our state and loved it, but couldn't imagine that they could ever be able to work here. I think they underestimated the number of good jobs that are available in our state, but nonetheless, what we found was this huge influx, and I do mean huge, from our cities elsewhere, for example, New York. And to use a specific example, last fall, I was in the Rangeley Lake areas of Western Maine, and they now have an affordable housing problem, which they've never had before, because so many people from out of state are bidding on the small inventory of homes that they've greatly bid up the prices. And that's great in many ways, but it has created some challenges for the local workforce. Nevertheless, it is a greatly welcome development because particularly in the northern half of the state of Maine, we have been losing population at a steady rate. And a lot of times people would love to live in Maine because it is so beautiful. Well, now they can live there and work there. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens in large cities to their commercial office space. My prediction is that a lot of companies will decide that they don't need as much space and that their employees can work remotely from wherever they wish. And I believe a lot, based on the evidence I've seen all over the state, that a lot of people are choosing to come to Maine and other rural areas. I have a friend who's a real estate agent in Washington County, a very rural area of Maine, and everything he puts on the market sells instantly, usually to someone from out of state, and sometimes without their even seeing the property. Is truly extraordinary. So this is a chance for rural states to reverse the loss of population, attract entrepreneurs and others who would like to live and enjoy the lifestyle in our state, and also for larger companies to let the workforce live wherever they want. I don't think it's a coincidence that the hottest real estate market in the country right now is Boise, Idaho. And I think you're seeing a lot of people from California move to Idaho. So this is a fascinating phenomenon, one that was not predicted at all, and one that is directly the result of COVID.
Absolutely. And I think there are a number of large companies. I think Allstate was the latest that just announced that, workers can telecommute from wherever they want. So I think it's a positive, definitely a positive trend for states like Maine. And I'm glad you mentioned Rangeley Lakes. I went to camp in Maine and I've actually paddled on the Rangeley Lakes and always thought maybe this is a state that I should retire in. So
there you go.
Anyway, but we want to thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your leadership on this really important issue.
Thank you. I do think this is something that we can accomplish in this Congress, and it's going to make a real difference.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
All right. I hope you all enjoyed that conversation. A huge thank you to Senator Collins for her bipartisan leadership on this issue and for making the time to join us and share her insights. And a big thank you to her staff too for helping make it all happen. And so now I would like to kick it over to our moderator, Kim Hart, and kick off our moderated panel discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Melika. Thank you all for joining us today. And thank you to our stellar panel who have a lot of insights that we're going to dig into. First, I wanted to start off on a higher level, however, and Ben, you have been part of Tulsa Remote, which was really it was really ahead of the game when it came to before the pandemic, trying to saying, hey, there's an opportunity for cities like Tulsa to attract workers here who don't necessarily need to be in an office. Can you first lay out a little bit more about how the program works and how you're incentivizing workers to come to Tulsa? And then I have a follow-up question for you.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Ben Stewart with Tulsa Remote. Thanks for having me. When we came up with the program back in the fall of 2018, remote work, we estimated, was around 2 to 3% of the US workforce. And there was a unique opportunity for Tulsa to tell its story of why it was a great place to live. We knew that it had cost of living advantages. It also had less traffic. It also had 2 James Beard award-winning chefs, a gathering place, public park open on the city's riverfront that fall. We had a #1 music venue, etc. But we really knew that Tulsa wasn't in the common vernacular of places to live. And so how could we accomplish that? We really took the kind of chicken and the egg game of talent and jobs and thought about that a little bit more holistically and looked at the population of remote workers as a really unique case study for people who could move with a job kind of on demand. And so with that, launched the program in the fall of 2018 and saw 10,000 people apply in the first 90 days and knew we were onto something. And while that $10,000 number grabbed headlines and surely grabbed eyeballs on the internet, we recognized that that was not enough to get people to change their way of life and ultimately move with their families to a new place, 60% of whom had never been to Oklahoma before. And so with that, we took on a fairly holistic effort to incent community and build community of remote workers, and have now done that at scale, having welcomed over 900 thus far over the last 2 years. And we know that when people come and build community, that they stay. Our first year cohort has over 90% retention rate, and we think that is incredibly important to building the type of community that we seek here in Tulsa going forward. But I think it's just more than telling the story of why Tulsa is a fantastic place to call home, and then building that community intentionally together.
So you mentioned community and all of the assets and amenities that Tulsa, comes to the table with. And in your conversations with hundreds of workers that have been intrigued and lured to your neck of the woods, if you had to name the top 3 things that people are looking for when they're considering a remote location to move to, what would they be?
Absolutely. I think there obviously is a paradox between remote work and place, but we are at the nexus of that. I think that obviously cost of living is a tremendous driver for so many people, and you're seeing that dislocation from coastal cities because of that. But no one wants to lead or move because of cost of living, right? You feel like you're trading down, and that's definitely not what we're trying to promote. I would say the reasons that we have seen such success with Tulsa Remote has been the affordable housing for sure. The ability to buy that first home for so many of our members has truly been a revolutionary game changer. And I think that moving from a studio apartment in a major city where you may be spending $2,000 to $3,000 a month on rent, but yet being able to buy a 3 or 4 bedroom home and have that space, be able to plant a garden, have a separate bedroom for your children, whatever that end goal may be, that's been a tremendous driver, no question about it. I think the ease of living, having the big city amenities with the small town ease has been a tremendous asset for Tulsa. It's kind of that perfectly situated 1 million MSA community where you don't give up those big city amenities, but you have some of the other assets and ease of life of a small town. And then we also hear about pollution and climate change. Tulsa is actually one of the 10 most climate change averse. It has ability to sustain climate change, but better than almost any other community, and lack of pollution and big open skies and beautiful sunsets. So those kind of outdoor spaces have also driven people. That ability to access recreation kind of on demand has also been a tremendous driver for Tulsa.
Great, thank you. And the flip side of that question, I wanted to pose to you, Laurel, in your work with working directly with cities of all sizes on how do you develop a community of remote workers. What are the top must-haves for a mid-sized city or even a small one when trying to compete with the likes of Tulsa for these workers?
Mm-hmm. Well, so much of what Ben just said is I absolutely just +1 to that. So we definitely need to see good infrastructure in place, which is why we're here today. We also want to see that affordable housing, outdoor recreation opportunities, also community opportunities. They're hungry to be a part of something on a smaller level where they can have more impact, exactly like Ben was saying. So from the city perspective, what it's about is not necessarily your size, because sometimes a smaller size can be an advantage because people are looking for that more rural, impactful experience. So it's not necessarily your size that's going to set you apart. It's really the rise of municipal marketing. How well are you showcasing what you have, even if it is no people, lots of space? Like that's a huge attraction for a lot of people. Or is it a great outdoor recreation system? Or is it a great accessibility to an airport? Or is it great community service opportunities? what is it that you have, and then showcasing that and making it as transparent as possible. Because some people do want to attract new residents. Some people just need to retain residents. Some people need to upskill residents. Everybody's program should be a little bit different. Not everybody can and should replicate Tulsa Remote because everybody's goals are different. It's about really identifying what do we have to offer, what are our unique objectives, and then making a plan to sustain both of those.
And if I could, I just want to echo a lot of that because I live this myself, actually. I live in Fresno in Central California and made the choice to move down here 4 years ago. As I like to say, it's the one trend I've ever been ahead of, which you can tell by the way that I dress and present myself is definitely true. But my wife and I just made the move down here, and we weighed a number of factors. It was all of the stuff Ben and Laurel were talking about, right? Like Fresno has great bars and restaurants. It has an excellent school system, which we didn't know until we got here, but it's fabulous. It has excellent, affordable quality of life and things like that. We also had family here that we knew we were going to be closer to. So there are these kind of excellent factors. But after that, I also got involved with the Central Valley Community Foundation here, and their recent initiative called Developing the Region's Inclusive and Vibrant Economy, or DRIVE. And as part of that, one of the key factors that they were looking at was something they called Second Office Fresno. Now, this was back in 2019. And the thought was, let's get a bunch of big corporates to open sales and R&D offices in the area, and that'll gin up a lot of economic development. And then COVID hit. And right after, when everybody after the world went away and we could get back on Zoom and talk to each other, it was immediately apparent that economic development strategy was now had to play a smaller role than it ever had before. It used to be the only thing for economic development agencies in local areas, like just get another fulfillment center built, just get a 2 or 3 or 400 or 4,000 head count, satellite office here, and then all of a sudden we'll have bodies. No, now it is about the micro talent acquisition. And so those societal factors, those social factors that Ben and Laurel talk about are increasingly important. But just as important when I'll flip back to my own example, when we were moving down here, I looked and saw, I can get a gigabit fiber connection directly to my house, because Fresno was big enough that the large telecommunications companies had done the service of building that out. And so that made the transition smoother. It's like, well, I know I'm going to be able to stay in touch with the office. That won't be an issue. Dedicated line, great. The more that kind, with everything Senator Collins said, and I appreciated DJ's toss in of vacation land on the Maine license plates. I also look at Maine with the sign on the front of the state when you drive in, which says the way life should be. I think that's how people are framing that version of Maine for themselves at this point. But it's, what can we do to increase that opportunity in more of these remote areas? And they're doing it by investing in a rural state, in their rural populations, because they can. We need to have more of that type of vision across the board in second and third tier cities and in rural areas and in exurban areas and where people are going, so that there is more of an opportunity to find a foothold. All of that is going to come with these social factors and with the nuts and bolts of, if you're going to work, you have to be able to do it. You need a support system. You need sort of a community around you in some form or fashion, and you just need to be able to get online. Right. And as we come to the thrilling conclusion of Infrastructure Week, as I like to say, no better time to be discussing that than now.
Well, and you teed that up perfectly, Michael, for my next question on the role of broadband, all of the social infrastructure that Tulsa boasts and other cities that Laurel mentioned it can bring to the table are a huge piece of it. But as Michael said, it all really means nothing unless you can actually do your work in a place that you choose to live. So broadband is obviously critical to remote jobs, and not just any old like internet connection. A DSL connection isn't necessarily going to cut it if you need to be doing video calls all day and doing high resolution, Zoom calls, but also presentations and so on to clients. So when we're talking about small towns who don't necessarily have the resources, or like Fresno weren't one of the towns that the big telecom companies saw the value in going in and building gigabit service directly to homes, what can small towns do to attract, to build enough connectivity, a robust enough network, not just maybe on the main street, but dispersed enough to attract these new residents. And Kathryn, I wondered if you could shed some light on that as part of the research that I know you and your team has been doing for a while now.
Absolutely. So I think that's a good question. I'm actually going to point back to what Laurel pointed out earlier about the importance of planning. In our research, we found that the most effective state programs, and in many ways this also translates down to the local level, are those that have a dedicated broadband office with dedicated staff and capacity and funding. They're the efforts that focus on planning and local technical assistance. And then there are those that, again, have competitive grant awards available. And when you look at these approaches, and whether you're looking at successful strategies at the state level or at the local level, the most successful ones are those that focus not just on, what's the cost per household served. They recognize that broadband, ubiquitous, reliable, high speed, and affordable broadband are essential to everyone in a community. And then that plan really outlines, how do we get there? What are the existing barriers to connectivity within our locality or within our state? How do we work with other stakeholders, to both from the private sector, from community organizations, elected officials, and just your average citizen, to factor their perspectives into a planning process and really identify a solution that's going to meet the needs of the community, and ideally help engage a private sector provider as well. And so when you look at really effective programs that have been able to increase the availability, particularly in high cost areas, you will see commonalities really emerge at that. The commonality is really in that level of community engagement and that role of planning. So I think that when we make recommendations to states, and when we work with localities as well, the first question is, do you have a plan? Have you set a goal? What does that look like? Ultimately, communities and their partners can feel confident moving forward that the community buy-in is there to financially support a network, and also that the community has sat down and really assessed what will work best for them in the short and long terms.
There's a debate right now in Washington as we hammer out. So we know that broadband will be part of the infrastructure package. We know that much, but right now we get to the really hard part, right? Which is deciding how the money is actually going to be spent, who it's going to be directed to, and where. And so there is a debate right now about whether it should be the FCC and the federal government kind of doling out the money in the form of subsidies and through the mechanisms that the FCC knows how to do, or if it should be, at least a huge chunk of it should be going directly to the states. And I'm curious what, as folks who've worked directly with localities, I have a guess of where you would fall on that, but I would like to hear your reasoning why a centralized approach may not be the best way in this particular instance. And Kathryn, I'll throw it to you first and then open it up to anyone else who has thoughts there.
Well, okay, not to be the researcher, but I will. I think it also comes back to, what problem are you trying to solve? And when we talk about the digital divide, are we talking about availability, just the presence of a connection? Are we talking about trying to address the quality of that connection? So whether that's increasing speeds, upgrading certain parts of the network, or are we talking about the affordability, which is the threshold issue before you get into things like cost and skills and access to devices. So being really deliberate about thinking, what problem are we trying to solve for here? And by the way, those are just the surface level. That doesn't even get into debates about the role of competition, prioritization of technology, middle versus last mile. Everybody's like, why are you talking about this? But it's important to understand, we have to start with those three questions and being specific about what problem we're trying to solve for. But when we're talking about really the availability question, which is that unserved question, and in some pieces of legislation, the underserved question, and Kim, correct me if I'm not tracking on what you're putting down here. But we are at the hardest part of solving the digital divide. And I really think that that's important for folks to understand, that this is not a clear-cut, easy squares or grids of unserved versus underserved communities. We are at a place where a high level of precision is needed to understand what where the gaps exist and what the appropriate solutions are to solve them. And so because this is such an inherently localized problem, you have to have state and local government at the table. And some of you may be thinking, Kathryn, you just said it's a local problem. Why do states need to be involved? States need to be involved because state policy sets such an important framework for opportunities for local deployment. So whether we are talking about the types of internet service providers that may offer connections in a state, whether we are talking about the topography, it keeps going. The state policy environment is very important to shaping what opportunities localities can use in order to bridge the digital divide. And the challenge with creating this national solution is that what's going to work in a state like Maine is not necessarily going to work in a state like Alaska or California or Tulsa or in Oklahoma, sorry, not Tulsa, Tulsa too. So by setting a national framework and Congress really focusing on what are the outcomes, what are we really trying to achieve, and then setting some pillars for federal policy related to speed, accountability, reporting, and then letting states take the lead in shaping, or identifying what are our challenges and what's our proposal for actually bridging the divide. I think we'll have a much higher likelihood of success of actually getting there within a reasonable time frame.
And for us, so we'll shift from the research review to the private sector view, right? Because we're coming at this from, at Upwork, we're the world's work marketplace. We are a mission-driven organization that wants to expand economic opportunity in more places to more people. The table stakes for that are broadband. We look at what's happening there, and I look at what Kathryn is saying, and I say, yes, and. It is very much a situation where we have to remind ourselves, and Senator Collins laid this out very well in her remarks, we're playing from behind, right? We are behind Romania and Thailand and lots of these places in terms of penetration and access and standards and all of the rest of it. So absolutely need that federal framework on those key issues to drive a lot of the next steps here. Then you need to look at the shovel-ready programs that are in place and fund those, expand upon them, set high standards, make it investment in wireline and wireless. Conveniently, we put out a very short paper today that says a lot of these things. That for us is, if we're gonna play from behind, let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, first of all. Let's do what we can, not just to make a generational shift on the digital divide, but to look at how the workforce has shifted so dramatically over the last 18 months and not wait one more day here. Let's get this moving. Let's get the money in the system. Not every dollar is going to be spent perfectly. Let's find as many programs that we can to get more people access to more affordable, high-speed broadband and high-speed internet technologies as we can, as quickly as possible, while also investing in the future.
I'm gonna
Oh no, sorry,
go on that point real quick, Kim, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
Mike said it and then skipped. I want to go back to this point of setting high standards. And I think it's really important to note that we have spent tens of billions of dollars on trying to solve the digital divide because we have set low speed goals, because we have not invested in future-oriented technology, because we have not had the appropriate oversight and accountability measures and supported community, state, and local engagement in this issue. We are having to spend another at least $40 billion or more. I mean, some of the projections are as high as 100 billion. That's just for availability. So when we're talking about let's make this investment, there's no such thing as like a fully future-proof investment. It's tech, right? That's the great thing about tech. It evolves over time. But can we invest with a higher degree of confidence in specific technologies, set those goals high so that we don't have to start revisiting this conversation of, okay, let's move that speed threshold up just another increment, and we don't have to come back to that in 5 years. So I think as we are thinking about how do we make the most use of public dollars, that's why we push on setting higher speed goals, focusing on accountability. It's to make sure that we don't have to spend this money again, as we did in 2009, 2010, 2011 on an earlier stimulus program. So Anyway, sorry, Kim, I completely cut you off.
No, not a problem at all. That's a good point. And to go back to one of the things that you said, Kathryn, in the very beginning of your last answer, which is about access is just a piece of this, that affordability is also a huge layer to whether people can get online, whether it's available, it's possible for people to even have, the ability to learn these skills to learn how to use the internet. And I came across a fascinating stat that I thought was really interesting from the ACA, a research paper that they commissioned, which is, it says 12 million households lack access today, which is their estimate, but 30 million households do not subscribe. So even if you have access, twice as many households are not even subscribing for a variety of reasons. They don't think they need it. For example, they can't afford it. They don't have the devices to use on it. All of these topics that are all factors that play in the digital divide. How, Laurel, how have some cities gone about saying, okay, we have the availability, it's there, we have the pipes, but we just can't get people to get on it enough to make this a robust enough community that will then have the social infrastructure that we need to lure the workers that we're trying to talk about here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, communication and education is so important and critical in this entire model and in this entire goal. I've even experienced this personally where in my community, there's one municipal leader that is very, very supportive of remote workers, but he has not done a great job communicating that value to anybody else in the community. So to the tune of when I go to a local library or a city office building and I say, hey, I'm a remote worker, the power's out at my house, I just need somewhere to, do an event like this for an hour. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They feel very, very threatened and think that I'm trying to hack into their system and steal all the city information. True story, happened multiple times. So I think the very, very first place that we need to start is being very transparent with each other about what is this? What does it mean for me as a resident? What does it mean for us as a community? And what are the benefits? What are the pros? What are the cons? And how can we support this type of industry in our community and help connect the dots of this ecosystem that remote work helps to stimulate? Because what has happened previously, back in that statistic that Ben was talking about, when remote workers were only 2 to 3% of the population, people would just hide in their houses. Nobody knew if your next door neighbor was a remote worker. I can't tell you the amount of times I've gone to remote work conferences and we've discovered you're my neighbor. Like, we live in the same city or we live 15 minutes apart, and here we are in Spain that we had to meet each other. So just being more transparent and being understanding how we all play a part in this, that we need Uber drivers to take the remote workers to the airport, and we need Uber Eats to deliver the food to co-working spaces and things like that. Like, we all have a part to play. And then in terms of that, saying, how can we as a community support this? So are there spare rooms in libraries or city buildings that can substitute as co-working spaces? Because those are the public transportation of remote workers. If something happens to their connection or they don't have access, they can go to a public space in order to still get to work and fulfill their responsibilities and stimulate the local economy. So we just really need to stop thinking about this at an individual level or even at a municipal leadership level, and really start thinking about it at a community and ecosystem level. That's where we'll see the highest level of success.
I think that's an absolutely critical point. I just want to underline, and it speaks to the success that Ben and Tulsa Remote have had in building community around this and becoming known for being a place that generates remote opportunity, not just because of the headline of like, we'll pay $10,000 to move here, but more like, then you get all of this stuff. You get a place to work. You get a community of like-minded people. You have access to a whole range of services that can be replicated on a micro level in communities small and large around the country. Another of the things that we call for in the paper is how you can build these types of resource hubs, put some money in the infrastructure bill to do this specifically, pass it through land grant and community colleges and other public sector entities, that you can say, build a place so people will come, find large private sector anchor tenants, pick your Fortune 500 company, probably has 2, 3, 4, maybe 40 remote workers in a given area, right? At this point, with the diaspora of people, say like, okay, so Microsoft, you will have, 3 desks at the new resource hub at, Montana State University, Whitefish, and your people can go work there, and they'll say they will a certain number of days in a month, let's say. That just creates a lot of cross-pollination of ideas about sort of what you can see and what you can be and all of that. And it's one really easy place that a telecom company can come in and say, oh yeah, we'll wire that building up because we'll know it'll get used, and we'll put we'll put fat pipe in there and the whole deal, and we'll make it, I'm not gonna ascribe total altruism to the Comcast and AT&T of the world, but I think we could derive value from that for them through a program like this. But that community aspect is going to be so critical to how remote work flies or doesn't in the relatively near term.
And I have,
sorry, go ahead. No,
I just have some statistics and case studies to back up exactly what Michael is saying. One of the programs that we designed here at Distribute was the Rural Online Initiative in the state of Utah that was designed to help retain dislocating talent that was going to urban areas to find sustainable employment. And instead, we upskilled the current community in order to be able to qualify for remote work. And so we were very focused on getting them those large, employment with large and sustainable employers. However, we did that, and it was very, very successful, and we were all very thrilled with the results. But when we layered on top the component of this ecosystem that we're talking about, and we started giving more education to current employers about how can you offer remote work and workplace flexibility in these tiny little towns of 200 people, how can we start to adopt these principles into our community? That's when we saw the magic happen, and our employment rates started going through the roof because of that local mentality that I can hire people that I trust, that I already know, or I can convert my existing position and still have all of the benefits of this movement that we're seeing. And this was back in 2017. Nobody had heard about remote work at that point, especially in these rural areas. So again, when we are really talking about like not just the ideal scenario, but really how do we integrate this at a grassroots level to support each other, it really, statistically makes sense.
And that's a great segue to actually the question I was going to pose to Ben, and then we're going to shift over to audience Q&A in just a few minutes, so we have time for that. But Ben, we've talked a lot about what workers want, what cities can offer them, what cities can do. What about those big employers who those remote workers are working for? And to Laurel's point, attracting them so that they can take advantage of the community and then even bring more opportunity to a city like Tulsa. What kind of interest from big companies has Tulsa seen since Tulsa Remote got started?
Yeah, that's a great question. We've seen members coming from nearly every state in the union and over 700 companies join our program. And through that, we have had the opportunity to really get to know the member and why they chose Tulsa, and also how that's being fed back to the company. And those companies are all struggling with what does a return to work strategy look like, unless they truly are distributed, which we are seeing come out more and more in the news. I think some of the things that we are thinking about to this end is how can we help our members advocate for what is best for remote work policy going forward, and how has this not going to be seen as just a fad or even potentially a pejorative word of 2020 associated with COVID, but really this is a game-changing opportunity for regions across the country and cities and communities across the country to allow diverse and talented workers into their communities, where jobs before were seen kind of in a 15 city clustering of the late 90s and early 2000s. So we're actively talking with companies about what their plans look like and how Tulsa and other communities like Tulsa can serve in those anchoring capacities like Michael and Laurel and even Kathryn is talking about at a younger age for digital learning. I think just an interesting statistic that I did a bit of research before the panel, for a community like Tulsa with 1 million MSA that has some of the underpinnings of fiber optics, like I mentioned in prep for the panel, due to our kind of disposition and geography in the middle part of the country, We were very early to have very, very wide broadband access, but even today, 15% of our citizens do not have access to broadband. And so seeing that kind of where urban meets rural, as Tulsa maybe appears to many in the audience, we still have 15% of our citizens who don't have that access to work remotely or learn digitally.
Great, thank you so much, Ben. And I'm going to shift over to audience Q&A. I will direct it to one of our panelists that I think would probably be best suited to answer, but then of course, feel free to chime in. We're going to kind of do a bit of a lightning round here since we have 9 minutes and we have several questions here that I think are really thoughtful. The first one, can you speak more in depth about how the rise of remote work is changing traditional urban versus rural dynamics? Laurel, wondered if you wanted to take that first, given what you've seen.
Absolutely. So the best way to think about this is a lot of what we've already discussed, that this is really revolutionizing economic development as we know it. So the traditional cycle is that we first attract businesses, businesses bring employees. Now it's that micro talent that Michael was talking about. So that's the first component, is that we can develop our economies at a much faster rate and a much lower cost than we ever have in the past. So that also enables us to diversify our economies at a much, much faster speed, with much more agility. So that enables us to attract more businesses that can be plan Bs to our primary economic industry. It can allow us to attract a diversity of different residents with different perspectives. So all of those enable us to really incubate communities much, much more intuitively and much more intentionally as well, to be able to create hubs of perspectives and hubs of people that share things in common, beyond just work. So we really have much, much more choice and empowerment. That's the entire basis of the remote work movement, is that work is something that we do, not somewhere that we go. So we're really empowering employees to have much more accountability in their work. And we're doing the same thing with communities. Where do you want to live? Not where do you have to live? Where do you want to live and why? And people can share their community in common, not just their job.
Thank you. And Kathryn, this one is for you. Speaking of goals, what is a realistic time frame for universal broadband access in rural areas? Is it 1, 5, or 10 plus years? And will broadband expansion to rural areas leverage cable or satellite technology?
That's a question.
Yes.
Yeah. So to answer the first on timeline, it won't be within 1 year. It takes, broadband is infrastructure. That means it takes time, it takes money to build. One of the primary differences between existing state programs and federal programs is that state programs do have a faster build requirement in place. So as opposed to 5 or longer that we often see with federal programs, which can be up to 10, it's on average 2 years for state programs. So that's one thing to pay attention to, as we're thinking about how do we actually bridge the digital divide and the timeline it will take to do that for rural communities, those unserved communities in particular. The other component too, in terms of how do we get to universal access, I set a goal, set a timeline, please do. It's important to remember too, it's not just about construction, it's also about the availability of supply, the availability of talent in the workforce to staff these crews. And I would say to my folks who focus on remote work on this panel, that's one thing that we are hearing from across the country, is a shortage of local workers who can help with building out these networks. So you have crews that move all around the country. Maybe there's a way to keep folks within the states that they're building those networks in because they already live there. In terms of the technology that can be part of the solution, yes, all tech should be on the table. We would argue, though, that recognizing how demands for speed, both download and upload, are increasing, and as more folks transition to working from home and getting more accustomed to using platforms like this to engage with other people, we do want to make sure that public funds are invested in networks that will support those demands into the future. Kim, you brought this point up earlier, DSL is not going to cut it. Our research has found that states are prioritizing, prioritizing investment in fiber, which is why we recommend increase the speed minimums and prioritize investment in fiber. If the government and internet service providers would like to do fiber to every home, great. But that will be an expensive investment, particularly given how remote some of our communities are throughout the country. So while we recommend a prioritization of fiber, we also recognize that other solutions, be it cable, wireless, satellite, other technologies will certainly be part of that package for the last mile.
Thank you. Another question. I'm not sure who is best equipped to answer this, so someone just feel free to chime in. What impact will the rise of remote work have on economic opportunity for people with disabilities and also for caretaking communities?
I'm going to take that one actually, because we've done some research on this with our Freelance Forward report, which we've done for the last 7 years now. Broadly speaking, if you look at the community of independent work, and I think that remote does not fit neatly into that, but it is in some cases adjacent to, in some cases part of, et cetera, that. If you look at independent work, that's roughly 59, 60 million people touch that every year. Of those who self-identify as people who work independently, nearly just over 40% say they cannot work a traditional 9-to-5 full-time job because they have a primary caregiving relationship, they are living with a mental or physical disability, other sort of extant factors on their ability to be part of the workforce. So that is tens of millions of people that would otherwise not be in the workforce at all that now are able to, because they're able to work independently, and I think as an offshoot of that, remotely. For us, obviously, that's a huge motivating factor for why we do what we do with Upwork in trying to build economic opportunity for people around the country and around the world. But I think it also speaks to the economic imperative of getting more access to more places and more people more readily, because as we now have seen this massive opportunity with remote, take hold. And it is going to it's not going to be a hockey stick graph. It's going to look a little more like a sine wave. I think people are going to do this for a while and some are going to shift back. But on the whole, I think there's a lot of people that are going to look at this and say, I have now more opportunities than before to do what I want. I think it's a potentially massive positive shift. We talked about, changing the rural and urban divide or making that better and closing the digital divide overall. Just the same, I think those that would be on the outside looking in of an economy in recovery, of a workforce that is driving that recovery, now have more of an opportunity to be part of that because of remote and independent opportunity. That is only going to take hold, though, if we give them the access to that table stakes of getting online and the skills and community that they need while supporting that development overall at a policy level.
Thank you, Michael. And unfortunately, it is 1:59, so I'm going to end it there and pass it back to Milika. But thank you so much to the panelists who, it was a great conversation and brought a lot of insights to the table. So thank you. Milika, back to you.
Thank you so much. A huge thank you to Upwork, our partner in the Rise of Remote series. A big thank you to our wonderful panelists and moderator. Thank you so much for sharing your time and expertise with us. As I mentioned earlier, the webinar was recorded, so we'll post the recording on our website along with a brief recap very soon. And we hope you'll join us for the next and final event in the Rise of Remote series. It'll be held on Wednesday, July 14th, and will be focused on harnessing remote work to boost entrepreneurship and the US economy. We look forward to seeing you all next time and hope you have a great day.